Hello everyone. So welcome to this lecture series on general psychology. I am Dr. Olivia Kakati Sharma. I am a psychologist and researcher and I'm UGC NET qualified, and I have just completed my PhD from University of Delhi, and I have completed my MSc in clinical psychology from Christ University, Bangalore. So welcome to the second lecture series on motivation. So today we shall be discussing on what is motivation, the different types of motivation, the differences between the different types of motivation. Then we shall go on to the motivation theories, more specifically the content or the need-based theories of motivation and the process theories of motivation. And then we'll end our journey today on motivation by talking about how motivation is important in the clinical context. Okay, so let us begin. So let us begin our journey on motivation by understanding what is motivation. So motivation etymologically is derived from the Latin word movere, okay, which means to move, okay. So motivation is a general term which is applied to this entire class of drives, needs and desires, okay. Drives, needs, desires, wishes, or all other similar forces, okay. So to say that managers, maybe motivate their subordinates is to say that they do those things that, which will induce hope or which will induce them to do things in which they can, by which they can act in a desired manner, okay. So many people understand motivation as like the driving force behind an action, something which directs. So as you see here, something which initiates, directs and sustains behavior, okay. So three things are important here. Firstly, motivation is an internal process, an internal drive, an internal force that a person feels that initiates, directs and sustains behaviors or actions, okay. So motivation can be considered as having a state of encouragement to do something. It is not only something that initiates a process, but it also directs it and it leads to some observable actions or outcomes, okay. So the simplest explanation about motivation in layman's term can be in terms of, answering these questions to ourselves, that why do people do what they do, okay? Why do we go on every day living our lives and trying to find justification for our existence, okay? The question why do we do something, or why do we go on about doing something, trying to find some justification for our existence? What is the purpose in things about what motivate us to lead our life the way we do, okay? That is what we call motivation, okay? So people we know are different, right? So it follows that what motivates people is also different. That brings us to our next topic, which is the classification of motivation. So since people are different and what motivates them or what drives them is different, that is why people are motivated by these different classes of motivation, okay? So let's go over them one by one. The first one is primary motivation. So primary motivation are the motives which are involved with our need for self-preservation or sustenance, okay? So these motives or these kind of drives are very biological in nature, okay? So our primal motives like hunger, thirst, sex, and the need for survival is something which is covered under primary or basic motivation. Okay, so these motives influence a person's behavior at a very basic level, right? It is very primal in nature. It is very survival oriented in nature. That is why it is called primary motivation or our biological or basic motivation. The next type of motivation is what we call the secondary motivation. Okay, mind you, how primary motivation is biological in nature, secondary motivation is something which is learned. Okay, these are not our biological needs for self-preservation, but these are the drives which differ from one person to another. Okay, because in many ways they involve a person's own sense of values and priorities in life. Okay, for example, these some examples of secondary motivation include the need for achievement, affiliation, power. We'll discuss this in detail in the later sections, but as you can see, these kind of secondary motivations like achievement, how much one wants to achieve in life, what is the need for affiliation, what is their role, what kind of relationships do they desire in life, what kind of social or political or any kind of societal affiliations they desire in life, what is their need for power, how power hungry they are, what kind of control they want to exert over different things. That is something which is not innate, right? You learn this kind of motivation based on your nature and nurture, the kind of environment you are born into, the kind of environment you grow up in. Those lead to the formation of such kind of secondary motivation. Okay, so this type of motivation, what we call the secondary motivation, is basically divided into two types, which brings us to the next classification of motivation, that is intrinsic motivation, intrinsic, and the next type being extrinsic. Okay, right? So another thing that divides the primary motivation from secondary motivation is that primary motivation is based on internal drives. It is an internal force that drives us to achieve our primary goals, okay, or satisfy our primary needs. However, the secondary motivation is driven by learned incentives. So there are some kind of incentives which serve different values to each person, because of which we are motivated to achieve these kind of needs or goals. So it is also but obvious that since primary motivation means satisfying our biological needs or our primal needs, they are mostly not always very consciously driven in nature. However, since secondary motives are learned, okay, these are many of the behaviors which are derived from secondary motivation are very conscious in nature. Okay, what do we mean by conscious in nature? That is, a person particularly consciously desires a particular goal or behavior, and what drives them to particularly act or do something in a way is the kind of longing they have for something they do not possess. Okay, so secondary motivation, like I said, it's based on incentives. So what drives them is their longing to achieve something they don't possess. Okay, so like I said, now that brings us to our next kind of classification of motivation. That is the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation they are both types of secondary motivation, but they differ in terms of what kind of forces drive them. Okay, so intrinsic, as the name itself suggests, in, right? There's a constituent word in here. So intrinsic motivation is always driven by internal satisfaction. Okay, something which satisfies us internally. Okay, for example, you are curious to learn about something. You want to, you have a innate curiosity for something. Okay, so that is your kind of intrinsic motivation. Or suppose you want to do well on a test. A student wants to do well on a test because they have an innate, they are not sort of motivated or driven by what kind of grades they will get, but they do well on a test because they have an innate curiosity to learn, and that reflects on their test scores. But on the other hand, extrinsic motivation, as the name suggests, extrinsic, that is, what is that? Something exterior. The factors are exterior in nature, not driven by your internal forces or internal satisfaction. These are driven by what we call external rewards or incentives. For example, a person might want to, do well on their test because that will lead them to good jobs, which will lead them to, having good money, or they want to achieve good grades. That is why they are motivated to study and do well in their tests. So here we see in case of extrinsic motivation, it is mostly driven by external reward, something which does not come from the persons within, right? So these rewards sort of provide satisfaction and pleasure that the task itself might not provide. Okay, so this is important to note here. Thus, in case of intrinsic motivation, the act of doing the task provides satisfaction, right? The act of doing the task itself provides satisfaction. But in case of extrinsic motivation, the act of doing the task does not provide the satisfaction, may or may not provide the satisfaction, but the rewards or incentives so the task provides some kind of rewards or incentives, which in turn provide satisfaction. Okay. So it is also important to note that the rewards might not always be monetary in nature, or might not always be incentives like, something physical, okay, something which is measurable. But these people who are extrinsically motivated might also work or be driven to work towards something for rewards, like, maybe a smiling face, something as minor as maybe if they do something, they'll get a smile from somebody else, okay? But can also be major, like a person will be, if they work in this direction, they'll be maybe blessed with fame and fortune and things like that, okay? So the rewards need not always be, the rewards or the incentives need not always be physically measurable in nature. It might also be other kinds of rewards, like maybe a nod of approval, maybe their need for validation and things like that, okay? Now, intrinsic motivation is always driven by the kind of satisfaction one gets from the task, maybe on by completing the task, or even just by working on the task. So these kind of people, they did not only complete the task to achieve that kind of satisfaction. Okay, it is not always the end goal, it is also the process. So that is another important difference between the two. Here they are more focused on the end results, the end goals, but here they are more focused on the process itself. The journey is more important to them than the destination. Okay. So now, why did we do this entire classification about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation? What is its relevance? Okay. So it is in the clinical setup, it is very important to understand the core differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, because intrinsic motivation is something which improves long-term change. Okay, because extrinsic motivation, the kind of motivations or the kind of behaviors that are driven by extrinsically motivated goals, what happens is that those are not very sustaining. Okay, they are not very persistent. Once the incentives are no longer lucrative to the person, they stop showing those desirable behaviors. But if a person is intrinsically motivated to show a particular behavior or to portray a particular behavior, that can lead to long-term change. Okay, which is why it is very important to create that intrinsically motivated drive in a person if we want to change certain kinds of behavior or change their thought processes. Okay, which brings us to our next topic. Now, how can we indeed increase motivation? Okay,